Okay, I think some people are still logging on, joining. Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good night. We've got people connecting from different continents. Okay, let's get started. We're 2 minutes past 2 CET time. Welcome to this Foresight for Food webinar series, kicking off in 2023 with the first episode on Foresight Update Discussion. My name is Bram Peters. I am Foresight for Food Network Facilitator, and I'll be moderating this event. Please note that this webinar is being recorded, so we can later also share this online. Welcome participants from different continents, Africa, Asia, Latin America, North America. Really nice to have you on board with us. Let's start with the webinar. Just to give you a bit of a brief introduction of Foresight for Food. We're the Foresight for Food Initiative. It's a network of providers and users of foresight and scenario analysis with the aim of promoting futures thinking for food systems transformation. And the idea is that we support capacity strengthening on use of foresight, and we focus particularly on linking participatory processes and data modeling. And you see here the 6 different themes that we focus on within our work. Under the Foresight for Food Initiative, we have the Foresight for Food System Transformation Program, which is a program that supports the work of Foresight for Food and also enables foresight work in 5 focus countries. And this program started last year and is implemented by the University of Oxford and Wageningen University and Research, and is funded by the government of the Netherlands through the International Fund for Agricultural Development. And this program will also support a lot of the work of the Foresight for Food Network as we move forward the coming years. This webinar series that we've now kicked off today in 2023 will be the start of a range of regular webinars. So the next one we have in mind for the 23rd of February. So you're all very welcome to join that one as well. And it's an opportunity for practitioners to share their work and to learn from others. And we explore different methods, different approaches, insights, and we'll look at emerging megatrends and uncertainties within food systems that we should keep in mind. This is a demand-driven initiative, so it's very welcome to share your ideas and also promote your cases and experience as well in future webinars. So it's very open for that. Our program for today. So we have quite an interesting program with a range of very interesting speakers. We'll have a first sort of setting the scene by Jim Woodhill, the lead for Foresight for Food. Then we'll have a case on climate foresight for agri-food systems, focused on the national level in Lao PDR. And this will be done by Rathana Peou, who is the climate foresight and scenario development expert at UN FAO. Then we'll have a presentation by Keith Wiebe on the CGR initiative on foresight and metrics. And the third case will be presented is by Foresight for Food, and we'll be sharing on the experience with the Dhaka Food Agenda 2041. And this will be done by Jim. We'll have hopefully plenty of time for Q&A discussion. We've planned the session for an hour, but we hope to, if the discussion is interesting, if people can join, we intend to stay, by all means, stay for a little bit longer to continue the discussion. We'll be monitoring the chat for your comments and questions. So feel free to pose any questions or suggestions, and we will take this along in the Q&A part of the discussion. So without further ado, Jim, can I give you the word?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Bram. And thanks, Bram, and welcome everybody. Great to have a good range of people online. And as Bram mentioned, this is sort of kicking off a seminar series, and we hope to be bringing a whole range of sort of interesting topics into the future around this, also looking into the future at what are some of the big mega trends, what are some of the big uncertainties, and also providing a really good forum for people to share their work. Let me just share my screen for a moment and just introduce a couple of big ideas before we come to Rathana, who I think will just give us a bit more practical insight in terms of what we're actually talking about with Foresight. Right.
Yeah, we see your screen.
Okay. So just briefly, of course, the reason why we're all here is talking around the whole idea of food systems change and how can we think about the role of foresight or futures thinking in helping to bring about the big transformations in food systems that we're all talking about. So from the Foresight for Food perspective, we've been using this basic model of food systems. I think many of you will have various different models of this, but I guess what we're trying to explore is asking questions around what's happening to the big outcomes in food systems. How might those big outcomes around economic and social well-being, food security, environmental sustainability, how are they changing? How might they change over time? What are some of the big drivers that are shifting food systems? And how do we understand what's happening in the middle of food systems from production to consumption? And I think as we've seen over the last couple of years with the big impacts of COVID, the current war in Ukraine, big shocks to food prices, there's all sorts of big uncertainties we need to be trying to think about and factor in. So the whole foresight thinking is trying to understand some of those big trends, those big uncertainties, and how it might change the context in which we're all working around food systems transformation. I mean, just broadly, what do we mean by foresight and scenario analysis? And I think Rathana and Keith will take this a step further. But this is a simple way of looking at it, of saying, look, we're sitting here today. What's the future going to look like in 10 or 20 years' time? And thinking about that, there's two big things we can look at. Firstly, what are some of the big trends that we're pretty sure are definitely going to shape the future? We can think about urbanization. We can think about climate change. We can think about demographic change. But there are also potentially some big critical uncertainties, things we think might shape the future, but we're not exactly sure what they are when they'll happen. So outbreaks of particular diseases, natural events from climate change, shocks to the market. So there's some big uncertainties that we want to try and think about as well. And so that can lead us to having a number of different scenarios in the future that we might have to deal with. Some of those scenarios we might imagine are a bit probable, maybe a baseline, what we'll assume will happen. Some of them might be a bit more plausible. We think it could happen, but we're not really sure. And some of them could be a little bit more driven by wild cards out on the extreme. So in thinking about these futures, I guess we're trying to answer three questions. The first one is, how might the context for our actions or our interventions change? With what implications? What could be desirable or undesirable future scenarios? So if we think about what scenarios we might end up, we can think about which would be more or less desirable for different actors and how can we perhaps nudge systems in more desirable rather than less desirable directions. And we can also start asking the question about which of our planned actions, investments, policies would work in different scenarios. And so do we have interventions in the system that we think are going to be robust across a range of different future scenarios? So this is just a very short sort of insight into some of the thinking that sits behind the foresight and scenario work. So we thought we'd just introduce this sort of food systems idea and a big idea of scenarios up front, and then jump to Rathana and Keith to talk a little bit more about how they're applying this thinking in their work. So thanks, Bram, and I think over to you, Rathana.
Thank you, Jim. Just going to share my screen and just confirming that everyone can see it now.
Yeah, we can see your screen.
Perfect. Just going to put it on slideshow. Sorry. All right, great. So thank you, Jim and Brahms, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you all. It's really a great opportunity to discuss today about climate foresight for food system transformation. My name is Rathana. I'm currently a climate foresight specialist and expert at FAO. I work in the region Asia and Pacific over the last 12 years, and I was before the scenario coordinator for CCAS, which is the Climate Change, Agriculture and Food Security Research Program of the CEGR. Why that matter? That means that it has been quite a long time that I can be considered as a foresight practitioner. And I really think it's quite important today to not think about why climate foresight for food system transformation matter. It's not anymore a question about it. It's how can climate foresight can be of use for food system transformation. And I think this is really like a change of narrative that foresight practitioners are trying to see or to implement currently in different regions that are food basket or hotspot when you think about climate risk. Now, today's presentation, and within the 10 minutes that I have, and I'm going to really try to be as swift as possible and get to the 10 minutes, I'm proposing a deep dive about how we formulate pathway for low emission, resilient and sustainable agri-food system in IFPRI by sharing or introducing one of our foresight use case, which was to develop a crop story map. So we'll be getting there in 5 minutes. How to frame it? For any foresight practitioner, a lot will be defined by for who are you working. And then you can think about your next user. But under the work that I have been doing over the last 3 years with FAO, it's under one of the climate change and module, the regional priority number 2, which is climate, agriculture, climate services and decision support. Here, the most important words that you can see is decision support. How can we, with foresight analytic, with foresight or scenario analysis, support better, faster decision support that are multi-scale, that are on multiple type of crop, on food systems that are more and more complex and that integrate not only producer, but a whole range into the value chain. It's not easy. The aim here for FAO is to strengthen the capacity to utilize, I would say even to maximize agriculture services and develop that evidence-based policy and investment. We currently, in 2022, the same question that was 10 years ago asked was, how can you tell me that this investment is better than another one? How can you tell me that this area is going to be more suitable according to your model, and which model is better than another one? So we still be in the same type of debate 10 years after, with no offense. Within FAO, and again, under the team, and within FAO, there are different teams. The team that I work under is really about climate foresight, and the regional output have been in different countries. So what we are talking is already a process that have been already tested, already implemented. The category of output that we have are 3, to develop climate resilience and low emission agriculture pathway. The second one, capacity building and strengthening, which echo on the FAST program as well. And support policy dialogue at multi-level, where we can use trend analysis, early signal or visioning exercise. This is things that we are doing more at the ASEAN level currently. Again, when we talk about a foresight practitioner and the way it has been developed within FAO and the way I want to place that foresight use case, I'm not putting us at the start, at the beginning step or 101 of climate foresight. What I want to introduce to the team here and the participants is really on the top right of this. And any of my supervisor will ask me those 2 dimensions. What type of resources do you need? What type of time do you need? And what are your assumptions in terms of future literacy or data governance in that country or for those type of stakeholders? And I think this is quite important, again, to reflect on that as we start scoping our work, we start looking as making a shift in terms of future literacy and somehow that future literacy needs to be anchored as well in an institution that understand that there are assumptions, working assumptions, when we are going to some country, when we are doing some of our work, but there are as well the constraint related to resources, the human resources that need to be behind, the funds that need to be behind, and the luxury of having the time to have a complete process, because this is really a luxury. So, Foresight use case, and that's really the luxury, crop story map. And why I say luxury? Because we got almost 3 years to be able to test, to develop, and not only to use Foresight approach, but have as well integrated climate scenario, AZ map. So trying to have quantified model that can be integrated to scenario narrative. And I think this was really like a learning process with the governments of Laos, and a learning process that was driven not by external consultants, but by the participants of all of the training that was conducted during those 3 years. So crop story map, we currently have 4 of them for cassava, maize, coffee, and banana. The government has required, and the SAMIS project is going to, SAMIS 2, which is going to start next year, are going to develop 20 more crop story map. So there is, I won't say a need, but as well an interest, and it has been kind of proven useful for at least the decision maker, which was our main target group. So when we're thinking about climate foresight here, and it's kind of in a nutshell, it was under SAMIS project, which is one of flagship project that we have at the FAO in Laos. The training plus the contents of it was mainly developed by CCAPS, Utrecht University, and CIAT, although the applications and how we led into decision making was led by FAO. The activity focused mainly on providing evidence base. So how can you provide evidence about the future? Yeah, I can see, Brad. This is really like, oh, how can you make this scenario more relevant than another one? Oh, when we say it's a what if story and then everything is plausible, why not preparing to future with a S? And what does it mean to prepare with future with a S? It requires more time, more testing, more resources. And again, I put that into a luxury of the foresight practitioner. So the crop story map was only one of the outputs that we had into our foresight journey in Laos, but it was the output that was the most at use for the decision making. So at the national level, when you have a policymaker at the MAF thinking about future planning, and where should we continue or not to have future plantations of banana, for example, where should it be? And if it's in a red zone, what does it mean? Do we need to invest more, or do we just need to move to something, to a crop that is more climate resilient? And if that crop is more climate resilient, is there really a market for that? Is there really the resources behind it? So the crop story map, where, and I really want to emphasize on that, we were not doing the crop story map for the whole of food system, but it was an entry point to look at the food system in Laos. And I think this is really important to emphasize. The work here is really to maximize that entry point that was the crop by using different elements. And here's really our foresight journey. So we had different levels, the national, the regional, the village. We use different type of foresight methods and different type of tools that were developed, climate data tool that were developed by FAO. Some of them that was actually used or created in 1976, and they have no problem about it, the AZ map. And I think that, again, it's quite important. We revisit as well some of those tools, and we try to appropriate that into the context of Laos. What is very important here is that, and what I want to show in that visual is that the type of output that we have was very diverse for different specific use, and that there is not one foresight model that I will advise more than another one. it always depends about the next user and how that next user is going to use those climate foresight analytic or information that you're going to provide. The need here in Laos was not only to provide in those information, but to be able to communicate those information. And I think, again, a lot of added value of the climate foresight practice right now is for the next user being a decision maker, that they feel that they can understand better. And I think this is really an added value that we have to build on. That future literacy that have been coming, because we were fortunate to have a 3 years program, we had more than 100 hours of training. We had then champion, more or less, that was trained and that were capable to be in a front seat to develop their own crop story map. It was not something external. The input was external, but the output was really driven by the government and by the MAF officials, so the Minister of Agriculture and Forestry. Now, story map highlight, it's a document and you will have the link at the end. The story map highlight, we have 10 to 12 different components. We're trying to bring into looking at the cassava system, not just cassava as what you produce, where you should produce, when you should produce it, but looking at future trends. What are the barrier, the underlying causes, all that added value that you have normally when you do a complete foresight model. And then we bring contextual scenario, so relevant scenario. When I say relevant, it's context specific. We developed more than 16 narratives, but the government wanted to use only 2 or 3 because they didn't have more time, which is totally fair. And they choose and they drive the process. One of the key highlights again of that story map, the crop story map, was the map. And I think it's very important. When we created those maps, the map of the present, of the future, the differentials, which we call them the hotspot, was for a policymaker in a 5 minutes to be able to identify under climate scenario, under with EAZ, plus the different scenario that we have, the different narrative of socioeconomic scenario, to be able to evaluate where was the red spot, where was the green spot. One thing very important, we move away from only red spots. Why? Because it's not just to have a discourse of an alarming discourse, it's to have a constructive narrative where policymakers can look at future potential. And I think this is something that was quite different in the context of Laos. A second thing is that we're creating those maps, and through the feedback loop that we have with the policymaker, instead of emphasizing only on the crop, we look at as well the land cover. And we look at current land cover as being those that they wanted to protect, forest and rice paddy. They don't want to take over the rice paddy. So what you see in red is not only climate risk, it's climate risk plus if it's on rice paddy, plus if it's on the first national forest cover. And I think this is, again, very important as a tool for good planner, future planner, when you think about agri-food system, because in the context of Laos, when you think about crop, you have to think about land use and future land use. So here is just in a nutshell, what you see is different elements that you will see in any story map. You will have an introduction of the different decision support scenario that has been developed. The axis, most of you will have been already familiar to that. We bring to the priority recommendation as well that tool, that crop story map were then presented in Laos to the different stakeholders. There have been different meetings, so it has been a very inclusive process, not only for policymakers, but as well to engage or start some discussion with stakeholders that was along the value chain. So it was really kind of, again, as I said, the entry point was food production, crop, but it was really reaching out into the specificity of that crop and that food system in Laos. That's all for me. I hope I respect the 10 minutes. And if you want more information, you have it as well in that slide that I shared with Foresight4Food. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rathana. And indeed, I think much more to say and explore in this interesting case. So thanks for that. Let me give the floor to Keith to share on behalf of the initiative from CG.
Thank you, Bram. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity. Thank you for that. And as you mentioned, I'd like to share some work that we are doing on foresight for food systems in the CGIAR. This builds on work that IFPRI has been doing for many years, but is now broadened to include inputs and collaboration. I think you can see that now from our colleagues across CGIAR and indeed from other partners around the world. And thanks to Rathana for that excellent introduction and overview of her work. That saves me some time as well on my first couple of slides here. And Jim likewise talked about the question of what do we mean when we talk about foresight? Because if you've talked to two people about foresight, chances are you've heard at least two different definitions. But ultimately, that's because foresight involves many different approaches. And there's no single approach or no single combination of approaches even that is the correct one. It really depends on what the purpose is, who you're working with, what their concerns are, and indeed how much time you have and so forth. So it can range from things like scanning the horizon to anticipate big future emerging challenges, envisioning the type of future that we'd like to see or that we'd like to avoid, and then different types of analysis that can help us to evaluate different pathways. And both of those, sometimes it's characterized broadly in terms of qualitative and quantitative approaches. Both of those are really essential. The qualitative in order to understand the issue and the questions and the stakeholders that are concerned, and the quantitative to try and understand, what are some of the interlinkages that might be expected or some of them unexpected that we may encounter as we move forward. Secondly, to think of foresight not as a one-off exercise, but as a process, and indeed as an iterative process that involves questions and dialogue, designing scenarios to think about alternative futures, analyzing how those different futures might play out, and then usually repeating, because the analysis always generates more questions. And that's good. That's its primary purpose. It's not, if it can inform answers, that's great, but it's even more useful in generating questions about what kinds of issues were considered, what was left out, whose views were considered and whose were left out, what sorts of information were used and what kinds of assumptions and so forth. And in fact, many of the different components of foresight that were on the previous slide can enter in at different parts of this process. For example, horizon scanning as you're thinking about questions, engagement with stakeholders, envisioning alternative futures, different types of analysis. And ultimately, this cycle shouldn't spin indefinitely. You want to realize the outcome, which is to inform choices that then have impacts on the things that you ultimately care about, whether those are nutrition or environment related or inclusion and equity or climate change mitigation, adaptation and resilience. Is a whole host of those. Importantly, this process that can inform prioritization comes out of the dialogue. It can be informed by the analysis, it can be informed by the stakeholder consultations and so forth, but ultimately those decisions are made by the people that have the responsibility and the authority to make them. It's our goal to help them have as much information as possible in order to make those decisions. But we also understand that the information provided by a structured foresight process is only going to be part of a very complex system of factors that influence prioritization. And again, our hope is that we can provide as much and as good a quality of information to that without imagining that the foresight analysis and engagement itself is going to be the only factor influencing these choices. Once choices are made, then of course the cycle continues. You evaluate what did happen, that generates new questions and a new cycle. So it's an ongoing process. In the Foresight Initiative, we have 4 broad goals and work areas. One of them is to help inform a common understanding of major long-term trends and challenges. I say medium to long-term actually, which is on the scale of decades, maybe a decade out to 2 or 3 decades, the span of a generation, thinking about those big challenges that may be affecting us already today, but are likely to become even more so in the future. Secondly, working very closely with national partners, in particular countries that are the focus of our initiative, to help them to understand the choices, opportunities, trade-offs that they face and what sorts of opportunities that they have to influence those. To support these 2 first goals and objectives, 2 more. One is to improve access to and transparency of different types of foresight data and analytical tools that can be used. And fourth, through capacity sharing in both directions to improve skills and tools, methods, data, and ultimately the results that come out of this type of approach. Very briefly, the analytical side of the initiative has three major components. One on the left really gets down to the subnational and even the pixel level in terms of climate data, water and hydrology, crop modeling, livestock modeling, things like that, that can occur on a very localized level. Moving to the top, then how those things interact on a much more large spatial scale, regional and ultimately global in terms of agricultural production and markets. And then finally bringing those together in the lower right at the national scale, where policymakers confront choices facing not just agriculture, but all elements of the food system and indeed within the wider economy as well, and using different analytical tools linked in various ways to approach these different parts of the problem. We work with a particular focus in some areas, but within a global context, recognizing that food systems these days, not just through climate, but through trade and through social media and in so many different ways are globally interconnected. So you have to have awareness of the changing global context, but with a particular focus on developing regions. And within those, our initial focus is on Eastern Southern Africa and on South Asia. And indeed, within those, a further focus on selected countries, Kenya, Rwanda, Malawi, Zambia, Bangladesh, and Nepal to begin with, but gradually expanding over time. And with some additional partnerships with some of the larger middle-income countries in different regions that already have extensive capacity in their own foresight-related work, including Brazil, China, India, Indonesia, and South Africa. As mentioned, it's a huge topic. It's impossible, unrealistic, and naive to think that anyone would be able to do it without partners. And in fact, we work with a number of different partners in Africa. We work primarily with a network called the African Network of Agricultural Policy Research Institutes, IFPRI. We had a very nice meeting with members of those institutes from 15 countries last 2 weeks ago in Nairobi to begin our collaboration in that region. As I mentioned, more established institutions like Embrapa in Brazil or the Chinese Academy of Agricultural Sciences and so forth. Many other global research institutes and networks, the AgMIP network of climate, crop, and economic modelers, Oxford, Wageningen University, Foresight for Food, among many others, as well as there are other CGIAR initiatives that work in closely related areas, some of them focusing on climate, like the Mitigate Plus initiative or the Climber initiative, others focusing on policies and strategies or different regions or nutrition and many other dimensions of food systems. So that's a very quick overview. Just a few activities that are currently underway, and this sort of represents the cycle that I was talking about earlier that involves engagement and capacity strengthening and analytical development, as well as types of analyses. A number of examples already underway, including some early results looking at country impacts of the conflict in Ukraine on food, fuel, fertilizer prices, as well as income and poverty in about 20 countries, and a series of briefs that are looking at or asking the question, what do we know about the future of X? You know, it might be a particular theme, it might be a particular region, but as it relates to the emergence of food systems. So lots underway, and very much look forward to hearing what others are doing and to look for opportunities to collaborate. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Keith. And it's really interesting to see this sort of very global initiative harnessing so many different sources of information and data and partners as well. So very interesting to dive into. Just as a comment to what someone said in the chat, we will be sharing these presentations with you after the presentation. So not to worry if you've not captured everything. Let's go to the third case of the day, the final case before the Q&A session. Jim, go ahead. Yeah, it's there now.
Great. Hang on, I just need to. What have I done with my camera here? Well, I think you can, yes, so that's working, Bram?
Yeah, we can't see you, but the presentation's there.
Okay, now you can see me as well. I found the right buttons. So I just wanted to give a little bit of insight into some of the thinking we've been doing about an overall Foresight for Food approach. And I think, as both Keith and Rathana have said, there's no one approach, there's no one way of doing this. But as Foresight for Food, we've tried to get a little bit of an overarching view to help guide some work on foresight. So I'd like to explain that and then talk a little bit about how we've been applying that, looking at Dhaka in Bangladesh and developing an Agenda 2041 for Dhaka's food system. Just a little interlude for those that want a bit of lightening up. I mean, this, apologies those that have already seen this, but just cartoon-wise, what are we actually talking about? I mean, it's very easy to be looking backwards. It's very easy to think everything's going fine. How do we just look into the future to say, where are those crocodiles and can we avoid them? And I guess the idea that if we look a little bit into the future, we can maybe make decisions at the right point in time to be able to go a different route. And using the scenario thinking to do that. So scenarios is all about being prepared for alternative futures, and foresight thinking about how the future to improve decision making today. So just why foresight and scenarios, and I think Keith and Rathana have mentioned this a little bit, but of course we've got all of these different possible futures, but also recognizing the future we end up in is very much created by the way we imagine that future today. So the discussions we have, the dialogues that we have, the way we think about the future unfolding helps to actually create that future. Not that we're trying to predict the future, that's impossible, as anybody would know from the various crises we've seen the last couple of years, but hopefully it enables us to be more learning orientated, more adaptive, and more responsive to both the risks and the opportunities. So foresight can enable us to be more explicit about the future consequences of today's actions or significantly lack of action. It can enable us to be a bit more aware of the future pressures, shocks, and risks to a system, so we can really try and focus on what that means for resilience. We can look at what we think would be desirable or undesirable future states of a system. Think about the sort of societal understanding that's needed to bring about systems change, and enable more anticipatory and adaptive policy and investment processes. So that's why we're doing all of this stuff. We've basically been linking, sorry. What has happened there? Yeah, we've basically been linking three things together around Foresight for Food. So the systems model that I already talked about, overall framework for explaining foresight and scenario analysis, and then a step-by-step model. And let me just say very briefly a few things about this, but you can find much more about this on the Foresight for Food website. Sorry, I'm not quite sure what happened to the title there on this one. I've already explained this, but just being very explicit about food systems and what we mean by food systems is a really important starting point, and to get stakeholders thinking about what a food system actually involves. For the Foresight for Food framework, we've just drawn together a few core ideas. So one is, how do you do systems thinking? How do you think about the importance of stakeholder engagement and participatory processes? How do you underpin all of this by the sort of knowledge-based data modeling, empirical work, and then bringing in scenarios and vision thinking and looking at trends and drivers and uncertainties, and driving all of this from the key actors in the system? What are their values and interests? So this is a bit of a framework for the big picture thinking we have. And in somewhat of a linear way, you can then think about these steps. So how do you work with stakeholders to scope an overall foresight and scenario process? How do you get into mapping the food system, looking at the big trends and uncertainties, constructing scenarios, And then really importantly, taking that through into the systems change area. So how do you assess the implications for different stakeholders or society at large? How can you explore the system changes that you think would be desirable? And how do you think about designing pathways for change to actually make change happen? And in each of these steps, you can think about a whole range of different models and techniques and tools that can be used. So just to illustrate a little bit of how this has been put into practice in Dhaka in Bangladesh. And I think some of the colleagues from Wageningen that are working on this are also on the call, but working with the city councils and national government in Bangladesh with FAO and supported by Wageningen to develop Food Agenda 21 for the city of Dhaka. And if you imagine that the population is going to increase by about 50%, it's projected that people's incomes might increase by even threefold, so a huge change in demand in food. In 20 years' time, what is going to happen to people's diets? What's that going to mean for trading relationships? What is climate change going to mean? Should the city of Dhaka be focusing on imports, or should they be focusing on supermarkets or on improving wet markets? So a huge range of issues that impact on how you think about Dhaka's future food system. So what we did was a whole lot of both online and workshop processes around mapping the food system, using a lot of visual techniques, both online and good old butcher's paper work. So really trying to help people to understand what are the critical relationships in the system that need to be understood. We did a lot of gathering of data. So we gathered as much data as we could and organized all of that around the food systems model. And we had all of that data up around a wall in a workshop, everybody walking around and looking at that and exploring what they thought the implications of that would be for the future of Dhaka's food system. And I think what we often find is the data is often very fragmented. So you get nutrition data, you get agriculture data, but it's very rare that you get all of this pulled together in an integrated way at the moment. We then explored some really big uncertainties. So what would be the big uncertainties that would really shape the future of Dhaka's food system? And we talked about resilience to climate change. Would you have a resilient or a lack of resilient system? We talked about trade, about the degree of equity, about vulnerability in food prices. But in the end, we decided that would be two huge uncertainties that would really shift the food system in the future. I mean, basically, it's not surprising. What would be the consumption patterns? So at an extreme end, would people in Dhaka be eating more of a North American diet in 20 years' time, or something more like what they're eating now? That's going to have a huge impact on the driver of the food system. And the other one was what would happen to business structure. Would it be more as it is now with lots of small, micro, medium scale enterprises? Or again, would it be more of a European northern model where you have huge consolidation, a few very big, large firms driving the food system? And out of that, we started constructing some scenarios around those two big uncertainties, looked at the role of business, the role of diet, and what that would mean for how Dhaka's food system might look into the future. And then we used a whole lot of data and modelling stuff that was done by Wageningen to help put some numbers and facts and figures around all of this. I won't explore this in a lot more detail, but just to give you an idea of how that all came to work. And then we ended up in a whole lot of discussions around what are the implications of this, and all of this fed into what's now being developed as a Dhaka Food Agenda 21. And some of the other colleagues might like to add more to this later. So that just gives you a little bit of an idea of an overall process and how it's been applied for the city of Dhaka. Thank you, Bram.
Thanks, Jim. And I think really interesting to see this, also this very participatory process where you have all these different tools and steps involved to discuss this scope around the city of Dhaka. I think we've had some very interesting presentations, and I think I want to give my compliments to the speakers for indeed packing so much information in a short time. I think this is very interesting because we're seeing a lot of foresight approaches on different levels, different scopes, different approaches and methods. So I really want to open the discussion a bit, also to the listeners, to ask some questions to our panel, you might say. And actually, I'd like to pick out an interesting one already stated by Walia Martin. I think it's an interesting question about, how do we really go from sort of the science and the thinking about it to practice? So maybe, Walia Martin, do you want to phrase your question to the panel?
Yes, good afternoon. Actually, I'm just trying to say, how do we make more actual valuable use of the foresight work or outcomes of foresight? And appreciating what many of the panelists have said, because until it gets to inform policy, it gets to inform some of those development decisions, then we are just inbreeding among ourselves. So how are we getting it there? And also in the models, there's the issue of consultations, there is of research questions, what I would call research questions. So how is that happening so that the dialogue between the policy, they are not just consumers of the outcomes of foresight, but they are also contributing to determining what foresight is working on, and all the way to the practitioners. And practitioners, I mean from farmers to all those that are actually in the front line of the action of development in the food systems. Over.
Yeah, very interesting question. I think there's two parts of this question. I think it's a bit about indeed application. I think maybe we can ask Rathana to give some reflections on that. And then maybe the second question, I think, is a bit about how to make choices, right? How to choose, how to prioritize based on the kind of question and the use in the end. Maybe Keith can take up that question after Rathana. Rathana, do you want to respond a bit on the use case and the engagement with policy?
Yes, and I was reading the comments actually, because as a scientist talking to scientists, that is exactly what we're trying to avoid when we're doing foresight for food system change. Why? Because everyone have and deserve a seat into that table. The consultation process needs to be broadened, and that means that it requires more resources. And it is really very important to stress on that. It's not just the next user being the policy maker, but how foresight analytics are capable to breach a new discussion or to access a new discussions for people that are normally not at that table. And again, within FAO, the for better production, better life, and all of those is about leaving no one behind and no ecosystem behind. So if we were doing climate foresight without thinking about the stakeholders to engage, who need to be, even if they are losers in the futures, need to be around the table, that will be a failure of our approach. So it's kind of a core for FAO within the climate foresight. But again, I understand that is kind of a luxury of a process where you have multiple years to do multiple type of process, where you're capable to have a feedback loop, where most of the time the government is actually very open to receive different feedback and to co-produce this pathway. And I think this is really a change that we see in many of the Southeast Asian countries. But again, context specific to Laos, we are looking at smallholder farmer. We're looking at the workforces that is engaged just in the agriculture sector that exceeds 36%. So we're looking at the majority of people actually. So I hope it helps on that one.
Yeah, so I'm hearing indeed making sure that you have the conditions in place in order to facilitate a comprehensive process, as well as contextualization and making sure that stakeholders are on board with the process and the different steps. Maybe
and being very humble, because money will drive a lot of the quality of the process.
Yeah, that's a good addition. Yeah. So maybe then I can refer to Keith. Could you say a little bit more about sort of the beginning of the process and the prioritization and what that means in the end for how that influences the foresight work that you're doing?
Sure. Thanks, Bram. And thank you, Martin, for the really important question. First of all, let me just echo some of the things that Rathana said, which is that the importance of a consultation process. It's not easy, it's not quick, and it's not cheap. It does require an investment, not just of resources, but also of time. But I think the payoff is that the process itself is valuable. It's not that you're spending 3 years waiting for the answer to emerge. You're spending 3 years building that shared information and shared understanding, which is already a huge step forward. So first of all, let me just affirm that. Then, I mean, you framed your question, Bram, in terms of prioritization. I would broaden it and come back to this issue that I noted, which is, I mean, prioritization can mean different things. At the front end of the process, it means thinking about, well, where are we going to focus our discussion and the dialogue? Which are the questions or the concerns that are most important? We can't address everything, even though we recognize that there's so many interrelations. So there's some selection that goes on at the beginning of the process in terms of where the focus is going to be. And then at the end of the process, of course, there's prioritization. If you look at a very concrete example, you know, what does the Minister of Finance decide in terms of budget allocation to different types of investments, different types of policies? That's a decision that the relevant decision maker needs to make. The analysis, the foresight process, and consultation, that can all help to inform that process, but it's very much something that comes from the relevant decision makers in the end. Very specifically in terms of how to go beyond talking between scientists and engage with policymakers and practitioners. I mean, that's where partnerships are really critical. And one example is the engagement that we have in our focus countries, and one of those countries being Kenya. In our meeting a couple of weeks ago, we had colleagues from KIPRA, the Kenya Institute for Public Policy Research Institute and Analysis, including their executive director, Dr. Rose Ngugi, and they interact regularly with the Ministry of Finance and other government decision makers in Kenya. And our work with them is to help through a process that will evolve over time. They already have excellent capacity. We can share with them some of the innovations in methods that we are developing and some of the new tools that we have to continue to support their capacity. We can do joint analysis to begin with, but the goal is gradually, you know, withdrawing from that so that they continue and can do improved analysis, the kind of work that they're already doing, which is already embedded in a policy process. So, you know, there's a value chain of foresight in a sense, and it's important to make sure that the right partners and stakeholders are involved so that these conversations are reaching the right and including the right participants. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Keith. I think that's an interesting point that you're making, is that you're in each step of the foresight process, you're really considering very carefully indeed choices that you make and indeed the partners that you have on board to push the foresight process forward. So thanks for that. Maybe looking at another question that was posed a bit earlier.
Can I just add something quickly to that, Bram?
Yeah, go ahead, Jim. Yeah, please.
Just quickly. I mean, really, Martin, thanks for joining us, and nice to hear from you again. I think we also need to think not only about policy, but also wider society. So I think in the whole foresight process, how do we make sure some of these longer term implications are more understood by wider society, because that's where some of the pressure on policymakers and politicians will come from. And how can these processes support some of the coalitions for change that are also going to be needed? So I think we need to be thinking about how a whole range of different sort of change processes come together and can be supported by the science of foresight. And I think it's been really interesting during the Food Systems Summit process to see all of these dialogues that were held. It did bring a whole lot of different players to the table. And I think we can imagine going into a new phase where we're continuing some of that dialogue work, but giving it a much stronger underpinning in terms of the more in-depth foresight and scenario work that we're talking about here today.
Nice, Jim. That's a good forward-looking perspective as well. I think that's definitely something important to bring on board moving forward. Yeah. Maybe just going back a bit to a question that was posed earlier in the chat. Monica asked about how to nest and link national, regional, and local scenarios. I think we've all sort of had speakers talking about a slightly different scope. But how do you go about to link dynamics and drivers within those different scenarios? Maybe going back to Rathana, do you have any, you already wrote something in the chat, but maybe you want to elaborate?
Yeah, I think it was a very good question from Monica. It's how can you really have that foresight or scenario development and analysis that go at multi-scale? In the case of Laos, we had, for example, the national and as well the subnational really looking at the village one. The idea was here is that the participant will need to own the narrative of those scenarios. So the only pre-structure that we have was those axes that I show in one of the slides, where you can see what was the key driver of change. And that was the start of the discussion for them to write the what if story. The way that we did that as well was to look at as a metaphor that could summarize or that can clarify what was really that future state that was coming in 2030 or 2050. And that was a way for us to animate that or stimulate that narrative. That's the way we choose. Maybe there are many different ways, but again, the ownership of the participants and the buy-in was the most important part for it.
Yeah, thanks, Rathana. I think that's it's a good elaboration of your initial comment. Maybe can I ask, let's say, Jim, how do you also relate some of those bigger nested, the bigger nested scope around the Dhaka food system? How did you tackle within those sort of different layers of drivers and trends?
Well, I mean, I think when you start doing foresight at any level, you need to think how the bigger drivers above that are shaping things. So, even if you think about Dhaka and what people are currently eating today, at the moment, it doesn't look much like what people are eating in North America or Europe, but we know that trends are heading in that way quite strongly. So, that gives you a sense of saying this is what we imagine is happening at a global level, what might happen in that particular context, and what would be the consequences of doing that. And I think you can then work that down further in terms of the implications. So I think you're always, when you're doing foresight, trying to work from local up to global levels and back again and understand the implications. And I think that's where sort of some of the modeling and analysis and data stuff becomes super useful to help people understand the context in which they're operating.
Yeah, very useful. That's a nice bridge for me to reframe the question a bit for Keith. CG has a lot of interesting different models that you're using. I think you also shared a bit in your presentation the use of the impact globe models and the RIAPA models at national level. How does the use of those different models help to sort of move between those different levels within the foresight and the food system process?
Thanks, Bram. Well, first of all, there are links between different modeling tools, and that's because sometimes we're asked, well, isn't there one model that does it all, or shouldn't there be? And the answer is, well, there's always trade-offs. If you're looking at certain questions, then you're going to put more attention on those and less on some other things. And so it really comes back to the point that it depends on what the question is that you're looking at. Even if you are looking at the national context in some detail, it's useful to have global context and vice versa to be informed. So in general, in these cases, the links between the different modeling tools, well, they vary. Some of them are quite tight and close, and some of them are much broader, where we will take some global trends that might come out of one set of models and use those as background for another set of analyses, and vice versa, but not spend too much time trying to connect everything up. And that relates to a more general point, which is, well, and you may have heard the expression, all models are wrong, but some of them are useful. And that was actually a phrase coined by a statistician, not by a simulation modeler. And it makes the general point that any kind of simplification of reality is, by definition, it's going to leave something out, but it can still be useful if it's focusing on the things that are really important. And so that's one thing that's important to keep in mind. And furthermore, what's sometimes most useful about models is just that they sort of crystallize thinking, and they say, well, this would happen if these two things relate in this way and they're affected by the other thing in another way. It forces you to sort of think, well, what are those relationships? And you may question them. And if you do, you may question the ultimate results. That's fine. That's part of the dialogue. And it's really a way of just sort of putting specific questions and challenges on the table to see, do they match up? Do they force us to make some really awkward kinds of assumptions? And if so, then shouldn't we go back and question, how we're framing the question in the first place? So it comes back to the fact that the process and the dialogue are really probably the most important part, and that models are just one tool to help structure that conversation.
Yeah, really interesting. And I think that touches a little bit on the quantitative, qualitative, and the toolbox that you have as Foresight. And we'll be hopefully touching on that also in coming webinars as well. Maybe just a last question that I just want to pose to any one of you of the panel. Keith, you mentioned in your presentation the Ukraine situation. I think Jim was referring to a number of sort of big sort of things that happen and that they are so very difficult to predict, basically. And in a way that asks the question, especially from someone who might not know Foresight, is Foresight then even still useful if we have so many big unpredictable stuff that's happening and crises are sort of piling upon each other in the last couple of years? What are your thoughts? Maybe I'll ask all three of you to briefly comment on that before we round off.
Well, I'll go first. And I think you'd be surprised if I were to say, yes, that means that it's useless. My answer is no, that means that it is useful, not as prediction, not as a forecast. And we always make that distinction. What we do is not generating forecasts. It's saying, if this happens, here's what we might anticipate as an outcome. And so it's not a crystal ball in saying whether a pandemic is going to occur next year or whether a war is going to break out next year. But it does, this is where the scenarios come in to say, we can have, as Jim alluded to, we can have an understanding of sort of the big trends that we know are going to be shaping the future. And then we can think about, well, what if this also happens? What if that wild card happens? And we can think a little bit systematically about how that would change the story. It's not a prediction, but it is helping us to understand the range of possible outcomes. Thanks.
Very good. All right, Jim, brief comment on that.
Yeah, I think there's two different parts. I think one is the big uncertainties that we've dealt with, for example, suddenly having the Ukraine war or having had COVID. But other uncertainties are things like what will we be eating? So in the Dhaka example, we played around with if people were eating a sort of more healthy and sustainable diet versus a less healthy and more unsustainable diet, what would that mean for trade requirements? So, should Bangladesh then be thinking about building big container terminals to bring in wheat because people have shifted to a much more wheat-based diet, or should they be thinking about big highways out to the rural areas? You can start imagining what would be the health costs if people are eating a particular sort of diet, and can you afford that? So I think what we can do with Foresight is just start to get people thinking about what would be more or less desirable situations into the future, and how can we head to what's more or less desirable if we have some of that thinking. And I think putting some hard data on the table around those things, as Keith was saying, can actually really help to sort of sharpen people's thinking a little bit about those future consequences.
Yeah, very good. Sharpen thinking, definitely. Rathana?
I go the same as Keith and Jim. I mean, that's just showing how much foresight is needed. And foresight is about planning around uncertainty. When we are looking at how we could be useful and how we can have that feedback loop, is really saying there is not just one future. There are plausible, multiple future. Are we ready for that? And again, you can't change the past, but everything you do as of today is going to change the future. And hopefully the future that you have is a future with a big S at the end. So the potential of options that you develop or that you seed in your pathway are actually resistant enough against those possible futures.
Yeah, very useful. And I think what I'm hearing from all three of you is saying, indeed, foresight is a very valuable process, but mostly indeed because it forces us to reflect and sort of anticipate and prepare for the future. and the futures, like you say, Rathana, it can go in many different directions. So thanks for that, for those comments. Maybe just also to, I think it's about time to start rounding off, because I think also looking at time, we're already 5 minutes over time. Sorry, Saidat, because I want to round off, but please feel free to add your comment in the chat, so we can still read it. Maybe just briefly to share my screen with you just before we close.
Bram, I think somebody had a hand up. I think somebody had a hand up that for a question.
Oh,
maybe.
Okay. All right. Maybe then we have maybe a few minutes to just address that question.
I think say that I saw a hand up, but maybe.
Okay.
Yes.
So that, please.
Yeah. I just want to ask question on how important will be historical data when we are doing foresight, because that's the baseline. We know where we are coming. So how are we going to integrate it in when we are foresight? Is there any of how it's going to be important when we are doing foresight in the food system?
So the question is about historical data.
Yeah.
Historical databases.
That's the
yeah.
baseline.
Looking at
at what time can we put it? Can it be useful in foresight?
Yeah. Maybe Keith, do you want to jump in?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's essential. We have to understand the past to help understand how that might affect the future. That doesn't mean to take the past as determining the future by any means, but to understand what we can learn from it. That helps us to also to understand things to avoid. One example is a few years ago, we were asked by Lloyd's of London, a big insurance company, to help look at some alternative future scenarios. You know, what if we have multiple breadbasket failures and various things like that going on at the same time? It's because of all industries, the insurance industry is incredibly attentive to historical data. You know, what are probabilities of different outcomes? Because their bottom line, their business model depends on it. But they were coming to the realization with climate change and other things that no longer was sufficient. It doesn't mean that they stopped using historical data. It just means they also have to complement it with different types of futures thinking.
Yeah, that's I think a valuable answer. I think it also reflects a bit that we know ourselves best in the past, but we don't know the future. So we need to understand both, or at least grab a bit of understanding for both perspectives. So thanks for that question, Saidat. Very useful. Looking at time, I think it's just for me to briefly sort of round off and sort of thank everyone for joining us with this session. I would like to invite you all to sort of join us again in the coming for the coming webinars. We will be planning a webinar on the topic of quantitative and qualitative models and participatory process for foresight on the 23rd of February. Feel free to register at our website for that webinar, and I will just post that link here in the chat just in case you're interested to learn more about it. Thank you to the speakers for the very interesting introductions and cases that you're sharing. We'll be sharing that those presentations with the participants as well. And then my thanks goes out to all the listeners who joined us here today, and feel very free to contribute your ideas, your cases, your experiences also with us, because indeed as a network, we really hope to learn from you and to discuss with you further. So see that as an open invitation, and hope to see you again. We will also be organizing a workshop in Montpellier in March. For that, we will also be sharing various keynote sessions live online. You're very welcome also to tune in for that. So that being said, thank you everyone, and have a very good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Goodbye.
Bram. Thanks, everybody. Look forward to connecting again.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.